talk about the war. We just know it from the American point of view, and, you know, maybe a couple of stories we could have squeezed it out of them. But it'll be good to hear some firsthand accounts. So thank you. Whichever one of you guys wants to start would be great.
Ladies first.
Thank you.
Okay, so my name is Pam Grugan. I was born in the United States in 1962. My mother is an immigrant from Germany, from the city of Würzburg. Würzburg is located in the state of Bavaria, which is one of the two southernmost states in Germany. And Würzburg is in the northernmost part of Bavaria. Hi, Cheryl. Welcome. So my mother was born in 1934 in Würzburg and emigrated from Germany in 1956. Came to the United States and met my father, and who was also the son of immigrants. His parents and all of his aunts and uncles, or nearly all of them, emigrated from Germany in the 1920s. So my father says he was very happy to meet a good German girl, and I think he proposed to her within days. And they were married in 1960. As I said, I was born in 1962, and in 1964, the three of us moved to Germany, and we lived with my mother's parents near Würzburg in a village called Heidingsfeld. And so my first language, I've always identified my first language as German. We returned to the United States when I was 5, mostly because my father said they had trouble finding housing. So we came back to the United States and I started school in the United States, but I couldn't speak English. And I went to a Catholic school. There were no aids. It was just good luck. And somehow it worked out. When I was 11 years old, I returned to Germany for the first time to visit my grandparents and went by myself. And that was kind of the beginning of my trajectory in terms of my interest in history and languages and my own heritage. I have 5 children, and 2 of my children were born with hearing losses. So, which would explain some of the extra languages in my family. One of my children is Mayan by birth, and we adopted Mario when he was 4 months old. And so our family, because of our experiences, my children have proficiency in German, in Spanish, in American Sign Language, and one of them has proficiency in Arabic. One of my children spent 3 years in Palestine. Their spouse spent 3 years in Palestine, and my son spent a year in Palestine and graduated from the Quaker school in Ramallah. In any case, my interest in languages continues, and my father's choice to move us to Germany has resulted in my children's language development. But yes, Marianne.
Which ones of your family were living in Germany during the Second World War?
So, of course, my grandparents lived in Germany during the Second World War, my mother and all her siblings. And when I talk about my understanding of the Second World War, and with the very limited time we have here today, I want to share with you a little bit of memory from one particular day. The day was March 16th, I think it was a Friday, 1945. You see, Würzburg was what was called a Lazarettstadt. A Lazarettstadt, translated, is a Lazarus city. And the reason it was called a Lazarus city was because it was a city where the wounded from battles were brought to hospitals. There were 42 wartime hospitals in the city of Würzburg with a population of 107,000 people. And they had very little industry, so they escaped much of the damage that was done during the war until that fateful day, the 16th of March, 1945. There was a little bit of bombing in February, and in March, But on that day, within, I think it was 17 minutes, 90% of the city was damaged and destroyed. It was a city that boasted world-renowned architecture by the architect Balthasar Neumann, who was well known for his Baroque architecture. There's also Rococo, and it is a city that has a history that dates back to the 8th century, and many beautiful buildings and artwork, much of which was restored and much of which was lost. And I think on that day, 5,000 people lost their lives. Within the city, well, the bombing, my understanding is that the bombing was done in such a way that there was a particular method that was used where in Germany, they called them Christmas trees were dropped so that those who were bombing could see exactly where the target was and could just drop everything right within the target. The city, though in those times, there was the temperature of the city was between 1,000 and 2,000 degrees Celsius. The bells of the tower of the church in which my grandparents were married melted, and people suffocated to death from the heat and from, I read this all in German, so I didn't quite understand all the words, but from the shifting of the air and the air pressure. And of course, the falling of buildings and structures and the Great Fire. What I want to try to do today, it might be a little unusual, and I'm not sure I'll be able to do it, but I'm going to give it a try. It requires a very quiet environment. But before I do that, I want to show you an image, probably the most well-known image, and I'm sorry that this is so small, from the city of Würzburg, my mother's home city. This is a burg, I'm trying to remember, a fortress that I'm trying to remember when it dates back to, I can't quite remember, I think maybe the 1200s, but that's probably the most well-known image of Würzburg. And there was one other image I wanted to share with you. Let me see if I can find it. It was a little chapel that we call the Kapelle, which is the diminutive form of Kapelle, which means chapel. Oh. Here it is. So you kind of get a sense. Now, you've all seen images of Germany and its architecture, and so it probably doesn't look unfamiliar. I was in Reading, Pennsylvania, where I was born, at an antique shop a number of years ago, and my mother was leaning against the wall. My mother's name is Hildegard Ursula Katzikowski, and I looked right next to her, there was this painting, and I looked at this painting and I said, Mom. She said, I know, it looks just like Würzburg. I said, Mom, that is Würzburg, a hand-painted painting, I think for like $30, beautifully framed. It hangs in my house today, but I was so pleased to find that I'm not quite sure who did it. My mother is waiting. I talked with her yesterday, and she told me the story of her experience on the 16th of March, 1945. She was 11 years old, and the bit that she remembered. I'm going to try to reach her, and if this works, I'll ask her to spend a few minutes and share her version of that, her 11-year-old version of that day. I have to tell you, she did not live in the city of Würzburg, so they escaped the worst of it. She lived, as I told you earlier, I'm sorry, in the town of Heidingsfeld, but Heidingsfeld was also bombed. Let's see if I can reach her.
And do you know who bombed? Who was responsible?
It was the Royal Air Force. Hi, Mom.
Yeah.
So I am in the library in Huntingdon, And I'm not sure this is gonna work, but I'd like to try it. And the reason I'm not sure is I don't know how loud, if this will be loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm gonna step back here where there are most of the people, but I want you to tell us your story, the things that you remember from the 16th of March.
Yeah,
You can start now, Mom.
can start now.
Yeah.
Okay. The 16th of March is when our city got bombed. And we were at home in our house. And when we heard all the bombs falling, we quickly all ran downstairs into the basement. We only had a very small basement, but we could see all the lights from the bombs outside through the little window. My grandfather lived with us, my mother, and then the 5 of us girls. My father was in the war in France. He was not home. So we heard all this bombing and bombing. And then after a while, we got so scared, we came upstairs. Opa said, we have to go upstairs. And we went out. My mother ran upstairs and threw the telegrams out the window so we would have something. I grabbed my little pillow for my doll coach. That's all I could get. And I took that along, and we all went up on the hill into the woods where all the people from our neighborhood, they were all up there. And then we saw our city just all burned down. And that was horrible. It was 90-some% of the city burned down. And while we were up there, we were so scared, and I was only 10 years old, and all I said was, oh, where are we going to go to church on Sunday? And some woman said, you shut up. Who cares when we go to church? We are worried about our city being bombed. And then we were up there, I am not sure anymore, but I think maybe all night. And then at daytime, we came down and we went to our house, but we were not allowed to go into the house because everything around the neighborhood was bombs in the house. They all got burned. And so we went down the street about 10 minutes. There was a big bunker, and we went into the bunker. And while we were in the bunker, there was nothing. We couldn't sleep or anything. I mean, there was no beds or nothing. We had to lay on the cement floor. And we were in there for a few days. And while our house was not burned, my mother had to go home and cook for us, make something to eat for us and bring it down to the bunker. And it was very scary because they were still dropping bombs while she was walking in the streets. And so that's what we had to eat. And we were down there for a few days. And then we finally got home. But then our city was bombed. There was something standing there. We could go to a place where we could get something. It was sort of like lunch meat, but it was not. It was made out of blood. And they put it in a casing, and then we took that home, and my mother cooked that. She made it in a pot with onions, chopped up onions, and that's what we had to eat. And there was a bakery, and we had to wait for hours just for a loaf of bread. So it was very, very bad. We had nothing much to eat, and then after a while, us kids, we took a train and went to a city called Rittighausen. That was a farm place. And we went from house to house and asked for a piece of bread or some flour, whatever they gave us. And then we came home with a bag full of pieces of bread. And my mother cooked soup out of that. She put onions in with it. And then that's what we had to eat. Because we had some food in the garden, there was nothing much because it was March, so there was not much to get. So it was very, very bad. We had very little to eat. So it was hard on my mother because she had 5 little kids. So, and then after a while, well, we started helping clean up our city. I remember how we went down to the church as kids and tried to help clean up because the church was totally down. And we had tried to help it clean up. And then little by little, it did get a little better. And that's about what I remember.
Thank you, Mom.
Anything else?
That's all for now. I'll call you again later.
Oh, okay. Okay, Pammy.
I love you.
I love you too.
Bye-bye. Tschüssi.
Where does your mom live now?
In Reading. She's 89 years old. She'll be 90 in September. My father they are living independently still and still very well. My dad's 88. So I'm very pleased, and I'm so fortunate to have them to ask these questions, you know, from the source. I called one of my mother's sisters yesterday, and I asked Aunt Ruth, after whom I am named, I'm Pamela Ruth, and I asked her to tell me the story. Her story, she had a little different version. She was a little older, just a bit, just a year, really, year and a half. And she said they were in the bunker for 2 weeks and that there were 1,500 people in there. I don't know. I don't know exactly what was right. They had 6 toilets, she said. But the piece, I remember my grandmother told me this story because I moved to Germany again when I was 19 and lived with my grandparents. My grandfather died about 6 weeks after I got there. I would ask her all the time, all these stories. And so she had told me this story. And I remember that somehow the bombs had not hit the house in which my family was living. And my family lived in that house into the 90s. And I lived in that house twice, but it hadn't hit that house, even though I don't know how you'd say this. I think it was, you say duplex. So they were double houses. My grandfather in the 1930s, the craftsmen got together and built these houses. My grandfather was a master carpenter, and their side of the building wasn't bombed. So my grandmother was not permitted to receive food from whatever organizations were giving food because she still had a house, but they also couldn't go into the house. So she would go, you know, and I remember the bunker. I was never in the bunker, but that year when I was 11, my grandfather took me to where it is. I could take you there today. I remember it. And I think at the time, nobody went into it. I just could see the space where they would have gone in. And so my grandmother would have to go back to the house and get food and bring it back. So I have many photographs and I have many more stories, but I don't want to take time from you, Graham. So I will pass it on to you. And if I may, at the very end, I also have a comment I'd like to make about just the last couple of days of my reading some firsthand accounts of that day and what that makes me think about when I listen to the news today. Yeah. Thank you.
You make me feel quite young. Mine's a very personal thing, because I was born in 1940, 24th of May, and in July, I think Hitler had heard about me because he started bombing. The Battle of Britain took place during that period. My dad, he was a miner, he tried to volunteer. Okay, I'll come this way. My dad was a miner and volunteered to go down to go in the Navy, but he wasn't allowed to join. He was in a restricted occupation because they needed coal, clearly. But just listening to what you just said and reading the book Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, what a total waste of time war is. Absolute nonsense. And we're doing it again. You know, we never learn as people. Dresden apparently was in a pretty same state as your town was. So, you know, all those things are running through my mind as I'm talking to you. I was quite small, obviously. My dad in 1941 he was down the mine and he was trapped for 10 hours. Smashed all his foot up. So I don't remember any of that, but it all had an influence on my life later on. My first memories personally about the war, I used to lay in bed, probably about 7, 8 o'clock, and I could hear bombers, there were big Avro Lancasters, which took off from aerodromes, which were about, there were two, Finningley and Lindholm. They're about, one was 4 miles, I would guess, and one, as the crow flies, probably 6 miles. And they would take off, and I was laid in bed, and you'd hear them vroom, 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 as they were building the pressure up. And the problem was, they didn't take off and fly to Germany. They took off and formed a massive formation, so that when they flew across and they were protected by the fighters, the outer planes would get shot down by the Messerschmitts or whatever coming at them, but the main lot got through. And they always bombed at night. That's why they had the flares. They dropped all the flares in the area. The mosquitoes or whatever would fly in and drop flares and light up the area so the bombers could really come in. The noise is still with me. When I hear a Messerschmitt, a Spitfire or a Merlin engine, which is what they were driven by, they were Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the hair on my neck stands up, even now. It's not frightening, it was a comforting sound. I know it sounds crazy, but I just love to hear those bombers as they circled around and took off. The one thing I can clearly remember is sirens. You know, this is whoa, whoa, whoa. They used to go, there was the warning siren, and then there was when the bombing wave was over. I was very fortunate. We lived in a small farming village about 4 miles from Doncaster in the West Riding of Yorkshire. Doncaster was hit a few times, but not many times. We built railway engines there at the plant works. In fact, the Mallard was built there, the fastest steam train.
What was built there?
Sorry?
What was built there, Graham?
The Mallard steam engine, which was the fastest one, did 126 miles an hour. But that's telling you the technique and building that was done. So at the end of the day, we expected, or the British expected, that they would get bombed a lot more. But it was easier to bomb a place called Hull in the northeast. That was where the fuel came in, where stuff came in, because it's a seaport, 26 miles from the sea. The River Humber is about a mile and a half wide, and the bombers could actually fly in, watching the river, even though everything was in blackout. That's what I also remember. There were no lights when I was a kid. And they would fly in and bomb the living daylights out of Hull, and they came into the West Riding, which was a major area, which is where I lived in Yorkshire, a big industrial area. And the area that, the actual area I lived in was the mining area, with deep mines, because we were after coal. They needed coal desperately to make steel and all the other things that were there. My dad, he was down the mines, I say, but unfortunately got severely injured. And he did go back to work before the end of the war. He was on crutches and God knows what for about 18 months, and they repaired his foot. But the next interesting thing, from a very personal point of view, that happened to me was it's difficult. You've probably seen films about it. We had evacuees in Britain. London, the main areas, Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, all the areas that were being plastered, literally, with bombing. They tried to get the children out, keep the nation going, I guess. And you didn't have the choice whether you had an evacuee. If you had accommodation, you got an evacuee. And we were very fortunate. Hull, which, as I said, was the big, is the fishing port and the shipping port, a massive place, about 50 miles away from where we lived. They were being bombed and bombed and bombed, and they never used to say it on the BBC News. Apparently, they said a northeastern port was hit tonight. It was Hull, because they didn't want the German propaganda people to know just what damage was being done. I mean, I went to live in Hull a long time after that, in 1971, and there was still bomb damage. They were still clearing sites and whatever. I mean, they were really plastered. But we were told we were having an evacuee. Now, I can't remember that because it was about 1940s, late 42, 43. But I do remember the lady or the young girl that came. Her name was Shirley. She was from a family of about 6 kids, as I understood it. And they'd been bombed out twice. I'm talking to Shirley later, and I've talked to her many times since. She was laid in bed on the second time on a place called Hessel Road, which was right down near the shipping docks. And she said they woke up with this tremendous noise, and there were 4 of them laid in one bed. They're all small kids. And looking out, they could see the house over the street, because the front of their house had gone. Literally, it had gone, and they were suspended up there. And they were brought out. Now, my mum, she was only a young woman. She'd had me when she was 20 years old. And she'd said to the school, the local school, the little school that I ended up going to the headmistress there, that was a collection point where they were brought in by a bus and dumped there basically, and then they were spread out among them. And she said, could we have a little girl? And the story goes, it was very sad at the time, talked to Shirley about this many times. She was dumped off there with her brothers and sisters, and they were all taken away. Ladies came in and all men came in, and off they went with this child to live with them for nobody knew how long. And Shirley sat there, and she was the last one. And what she didn't know was, she thought nobody wanted her. But what she didn't know was Miss North, who became my headmistress many years later, she actually hung on to Shirley because she knew my mum wanted a little girl. And she was sat there with a paper carrier bag, with a pair of knickers and a vest in it. That's all she could bring with her. That's how desperate they were, you know, everything had been blown to pieces. And she came and she stayed with us. And I've got funny little stories that people have told me about her. She'd always lived in the city, you know, I mean, down on near the docks. She didn't know what horses and cows and things were. And apparently she came home one day, having had a walk with my dad, and said to my mum, I know the difference between horses and cows. My mum said, oh, do you? She said, what is it? She said, horses are brown, cows are black. And apparently the very first time after a heavy rainstorm, she saw a large earthworm, you know, about 6 inches long. She came hurtling in and said, Auntie, because she called my mum Auntie, there's a snake. I've never seen one. You know, that's the sort of situation that she was in. Mum and Dad kept in touch with her. They actually wanted to adopt her. By the time she went home, Mum had got another baby, my brother David. And they desperately wanted to keep her, but the family wouldn't do that. And she went back and she always regrets it. She said it was some of the best years of her life. And she kept in touch all the way through. Until my mum died. She was actually there at the funeral, and I was with her in the last October. She's nearly 90 now, and still Shirley. She never changed. But the good fortune or the bad fortune for her was that she was bombed out a couple of times, and then she came to live with us. So that's a memory of the war that will stay with me forever, basically. Rationing was severe. That's to put it mildly. You could have an ounce of butter. I think it was 2 ounces of tea. Nothing really. And you had ration books to keep you going, basically. But because we lived in a small village away from the town, we weren't being bombed. My dad, being a miner, got a coal allowance. You know, they used to get a ton of coal every month, I think it was. And they were able to swap coal or exchange coal for tea and sugar and maybe flour for people who needed it for heat and warmth. You know, it was pretty severe. As I say, the miners' coal allowance made a big difference to us, and we were short. and meat was very, very few and far between, but we got some. And I survived quite well. One of the things that I can remember very clearly, although I started school in 1944, in the September, I was only 4 years old, and I went to the school where Shirley had been picked up from in the village, only about, like to the other end of this street away from where I lived. I had to carry a gas mask with me. I had a Mickey Mouse gas mask, had its ears on it, smelled horrible, it was rubber, and you used to have to practice putting them on. And you always took it to school on your coat peg in the actual thing there. It was, you know, we didn't know whether we were going to be gas or whatever after the First World War, you know, who knew? The rest of Britain was being pounded, you know. I appreciate the story of Würzburg and Dresden and all the other places, but they went in to actually finish the war. It was something that had to be done, I guess. To get rid of Hitler and all these particular fancies and whatever, but it affected everybody in Britain. You know, it's a small island. You know, if you fold Pennsylvania out twice, just one more time, that's Britain. That's how small it is, 800 by 400 or so. All the land from Britain would fit into that area, so you can imagine when we were being shelled and bombed and whatever. Thank God for Spitfires and the pilots and the Hurricane fighters who kept them away in 1940, otherwise we'd have been overrun. And then thank God for the Americans and Mr. Roosevelt, who actually supplied ammunitions and stuff to, just like we're doing to Ukraine now, just to actually keep us basically living. You know, it was a pretty horrific time. We were only 18 miles from Sheffield, which was the Pittsburgh of England. Sheffield and Rotherham were producing steel all the time. They needed it for the war, basically. They got tremendous damage. You know, there was splattered, basically, the city and everything else was bombed on a fairly regular basis. But that was war. It's a terrible thing. You know, and I've got these memories of it, and memories, some of the memories I've got are memories that people told me. Some, like listening to the aircraft and the hum of the engines, I can remember that very clearly. I can also remember, it's amusing in a way. As kids, we stood at the side of the road. I was about so big, not much bigger now. And the Italian prisoners were being marched through our village to actually, because they were kept not far from Lindholm, there was a load of them there, and they were marched through the village with all guys with rifles. I don't know whether they could shoot them or not, but you know, the home guard. And they were taken to the local farms at harvest time and to do jobs on the farms. And they looked happy. That sounds crazy. I can always remember that they waved and they shouted to us, I guess, but they were in Italian. But they were so damn pleased to be out of the war. They were prisoners, but they were marching through the village and they were fed and they worked outside, you know, an amazing thing for them rather than being destroyed. And I can remember that so clearly. We kids used to stand and watch them. Like as they marched with the old guys that were with them all the way through the village and went out and worked. I also remember very clearly, my Auntie Mona, she was in the women's army, the auxiliary army, and she was working down in London, and she met this American guy who was a bandsman, played the double bass. They ended up getting married just after the war, and there was my mum's best friend from the school here, and I called her Auntie Mona, a lady that I knew. And they went to live in California. They ended up in Ventura, in California. And we used to get parcels from her just after the war, because food in Britain was on ration till 1954. That's when they took the last rationing off, which was for meat. Other things came up very, very slowly, but clothing, everything was all rationed. It was all, you know, you had special coupons and whatever. And she used to send stuff across. And I think I was one of the first kids in Britain to have a corduroy jacket and you would call them jeans or whatever here, a little suit. I was very proud of it. I also had a holster that she sent. So when I had a toy captain, I had a real holster. These are things that stick with you, you know, from a long time ago. I also remember very clearly, and as I grew older, I began to understand why. There were people in Britain called Bevin boys.
Bedding,
Bevin.
bedding, okay.
Ernest Bevin, he was
Oh, yeah.
one of the ministers in the government.
Okay.
And obviously, digging coal was a major facet of keeping alive, basically. And people, they were conscripted from 18, they were in the army. You know, there was virtually no excuse you were in one of the forces. But I think it was 1 in 10 or something of that nature were sent down the mines. Whether they wanted it or not, I mean, working down the mine, it's not a very pleasant position to be in, but at least they were alive. And they worked right through till, well, after the war. And a lot of them stayed that way. Ironically enough, quite a number of Italian people stayed in Britain and they married English girls. You know, because they liked what they'd seen and whatever during the war, which was something very special. Looking at the time. One story I do remember very well, a friend of the family was called Bill Lewitt. He'd gone for a walk with my dad over to, he lived in this village, the next village about 2 miles away was the village where my dad went to work. It was a mining village, built by the mine owners. And Bill was in the Navy. He was in board destroyers or whatever it was in those days. And they were walking across the fields. And one of the aircraft, it must have been a fighter plane, I guess, from Lindholm, flew low over the top of them. You know, they make wonderful sound or whatever. And my dad turned to speak to Bill and he was laying in the ditch. His reaction to a plane coming was to get down and out of the way. You know, it had an effect. I guess now you call it PTSD. But, you know, in those days, there were shell shocked or whatever, like in the First World War. And that was something pretty horrific when you think about it. I went to school and I loved it there. The people were absolutely lovely with me, Miss North and Miss Palmer. I still remember the names, 2 ladies. And I stayed there and the war was over. But I can clearly remember we had celebrations in the village for VE Day, Victory in Europe, and VJ Day, Victory in Japan. And in the village hall, which was owned by the Eden family, remember Sir Anthony Eden? Well, it was some members of his family originally that owned the place. And there was a big, like a playing area, I guess, where they'd had cricket and goodness knows what. And we had races and we did things and we all got little prizes and, you know, where they got them from, I don't know, because we couldn't get candies. You know, they weren't there. I got Hershey bars from Auntie Lola in America, but they didn't compare to Cadbury's, I have to say. But yeah, these are the things that come back when you start thinking about it. But ironically enough, I'm not a religious person, but I belong to the UU Fellowship in State College. And one of the guys there is called Manfred Coombs. He was born about, I think it was about 4 or 5 when the war started. He ended up in America, and he came to Canada after the war and ended up in America. He was a professor at Penn State. And we were talking one day and somebody said, why don't you two do a sermon or a talk about your experiences? And we did. And I talked about what I just told you now, you know, how school was and everything else. And he talked about other things. And we concluded by standing together and shaking hands and saying, 80 years ago, we were enemies. Now we're friends. You know, very good friends. And that's the futility of war at the end of the day. You know, the majority of people, like your family, they were just there waiting as the guys who flew the bombers knew no more. It was just a target. You know, off you go, you're flying at night, flying very low. They were being shot to death. And ironically enough, when I was working about 1965, and I was working on the shop floor in a place called ICI Fibers, and we produced nylon. And the factory that we worked in was originally, the name was on the chimney, said Bemberg's. It was known as British Bemberg, which Bemberg was a German company. They used to produce rayon pre-war, and it was for parachute silk during the war. So, you know, it all links together, you know, and I was working on the shop floor, we were producing nylon. And I was working with a guy, we were looking after these planting machines that looked, and every time he went and walked down, he was called Jack, and he would sort of go, not noticing, there was a slight limp there. And I said to him when he sat down, now 25, I was, you know, what the hell's going on? You know, I want to know everything. And I looked at the guy and I said, have you got bad luck, Jack? And he said, no, just quietly, that was it. And I said, well, have you pulled a muscle or something? He said, no, it was in the wall. And I looked at him, because I didn't think he was that old. And apparently he'd been a rear gunner on the Agro Lancasters, which were flying in and out of Lindholm. And apparently they'd been pretty badly shot up by the flak and everything else while they were in Germany. They got back over to Britain and they'd flown in and were trying to land. They landed, but I guess the wheels or whatever just collapsed and the plane crashed and slewed across and hit a great pole or gantry that was on the airfield. And he was the only one who walked away from it.
Wow.
They were all killed. Some of them were still alive when they got there, obviously the pilot, but you know, they're the things that stick with you that, like you, so many people just, you know, for no reason were wiped out. That's my memories of the war. It was, for me as a little boy, it really didn't make a great deal of difference. I didn't know that you could have candies all the time, which you had pre-war. I didn't know that there was always plenty of meat. I didn't know that, you know, the milkman always delivered milk. But I found out later. But to me, it was just growing up as a kid and seeing these particular things. We did have an air raid shelter. In most of the places, they had what they called nissy huts, which were corrugated sheet, which they dug big holes and lowered them into, and then covered them over so the families could go in. We didn't have that. We had an air raid shelter, it was called, with a reinforced concrete roof, whatever. I can't ever remember being sent into it or taken into it. Apparently people did, you know, when the sirens went, but I can't ever remember being in there. But I remember as a kid playing on it and jumping off the roof, you know, things that as a child just seemed normal. And it's only as I've grown older and read about it and realised just, you know, what a terrible time most people had on both sides. And that's the worst part about it. You know, some crazy man, we've got one now. Some crazy fellow decided that we're going to do things in a particular way. And the whole of Europe, in fact, it ended up with the whole of the world really knocking the living daylights out of us, you know, each other. War is not for me. My son was in the Royal Air Force. My granddaughter now is in ROTC up at Syracuse. She's going to go in the Air Force for the Air Force. But I hope to God she never ever has to face any of what we saw or I saw as a little boy. I could talk to you for hours about families and whatever, but that was my impressions of the Second World War. Not a good time for anybody on any side. Thank you.
If I may, I'd like to piggyback on a few things you said, Graham, because you engendered some memories for myself. So as I was reading about Würzburg and the 16th of March, I read that in the American military newspaper, the Stars and Stripes, there was an article about Dresden. Dresden had been bombed in February. Würzburg was much smaller, bombed in March. And in the article, there is a quote by Churchill that regrets, there were comments that he made comments of regret for the way in which the bombings were done at the very end, the senseless bombings. Yes, head up.
No, after you're done,
Okay,
a feedback
okay,
to what you're saying.
okay. So you've mentioned Dresden on the front of the military magazine, the Stars and Stripes. Dresden and Würzburg were in the same article in reference to this kind of bombing. You
It
mentioned
was known as carpet bombing.
carpet bombing.
Yeah, they just went in and they didn't select a target, they didn't
Yeah.
say, we'll knock out that building there, they just said, take the whole lot. And they sent the flares, the planes went in and dropped the flares, so it was lit up, and although they were being shot at, and God knows what, they flew in and, yeah, and you just can't imagine the horror.
The horror.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was this morning reading these firsthand accounts and you are right. You can't imagine the horror. When I think about bombings, I think about death, but it's much more than, if I may, just death. The suffering is unimaginable. You mentioned Shirley, what a lovely story.
Yeah, we're still in touch, I even sent her an email yesterday.
Is that right?
Yeah, so.
My mother's youngest sister, Elfriede Brigitte, was 5 at the end of the war. She was sent to Spain because the family didn't have enough milk, I was told, to offer her. And then came back 9 months later and they said, the family said they couldn't understand her. She kept saying, see to everything. And I don't know the family that kept her, but thank God for them.
Yes, yeah.
My mother mentioned the blood that they ate at the end, during the war, at the end of the war. I must add, and Hedda could probably, and maybe some of the rest of you, there's a kind of
Called blood pudding.
Blutwurst,
Yeah,
or blood pudding.
We call it
I
black
think it's
pudding.
delicious.
Around here.
Yeah, it's just like.
Hedda,
From horse flesh.
horse flesh, okay.
Okay.
Well, honest to goodness, it is actually quite good.
I don't like deer meat.
Yeah, okay, no, then maybe not.
It needs lots of fat in it as well, it's really good.
Yeah, and a lot of fat, that's right. And salt, vinegar, and a good piece of bread. Right, Hedda? Yeah. I'm sorry.
I'm not Bavarian.
Okay. I also want to mention what you talked about, or I want to comment on what you talked about, how in war, there is suffering on every side. And there are those who have power, and there are those who have none. And we all do the best we can, even if we're not doing the right thing. I think about World War II and the Jews and how frightening it must have been to consider standing up for your neighbor when you knew what might come. I want to share, my grandfather, Johann Kaczykowski, was from the city of Danzig, now called Gdansk, now Poland. He was a conscripted soldier in Hitler's Nazi army for 5.5 years. My father-in-law, Dr. Hartford Ernest Grugan, was one of the first physicians in the Nazi concentration camps at the end of the war. My daughter-in-law, Maya Ariel, is Jewish. Her father is Israeli by birth and now American. My children, two of my children have lived in Palestine. My son-in-law has lived in Palestine. And so you can see here in my one family, we are all this mix of people. I have a son-in-law from the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and each of us shares these stories, and in the end, we're all just humans. And there are dictators in the world, and we might not be able to, maybe, I don't know about war and how to respond to dictatorships and fascism. But I think it's important for us to keep in mind that when our government creates laws that makes it harder for people to vote, when our government creates laws that censors the information we have access to, And when our government makes laws that takes away rights we've had for decades, there is reason to pay attention,
Absolutely.
because that's where it starts. That's how the Hitlers of the world gain their power. And I think that's why these stories are so important, why we cannot forget them, and we need to pay attention what's happening in our own country today.
Can I just finish up on a lighter note? I remember just after the war, Auntie Mona was, as I say, married Uncle Russ and went off to America. But our next door but one neighbour, Mrs. Briggs, she was a lovely lady. I knew her all the way through the war, and she was very kind. You know, I was about this big by then, and one day, her Dolly Briggs, that was her daughter's name, was going out with an American soldier. Where he was from, I had no idea, because they were stationed all over Britain anyway. And one day, they came round and they've got a bunch of about 6 bananas. Well, I'd never seen a banana. Not many, well, nobody in Britain had seen them, you know, and he obviously brought them from these at the PX, we'll call it NAFI, but the PX. And they brought them round to show us and show kids. And we went and had a look at these bananas. And they kept them for so long that, you know what bananas go like when they've been kept too long. And finally, I was actually given a taste of a banana. And it was revolting. You know, I thought, what the hell is all this? What's the point of it? I didn't eat bananas for years. Now I love them. You know, Tom knows I play golf and I always eat a banana or a couple of bananas on the course. But I've never forgotten that. Seeing, you know, a banana turn from a bright yellow, I think there were about 5 or 6 in this little bunch, and everybody went and had a look in the village, you know, wow, you know, how strange that, you know, things were like that. And oranges, I remember queuing just after the war, or in a line, as you would call it, at one of the local guys who was a greengrocer, and stood for about 2 hours and got an orange. That was in about 1946, you know, so the effect on the ability of people to keep alive and keep fit and well was, you know, very dramatic. But that's where the plain British cooking came from, I think, in many ways, because we just made do with what we could. But always remember, bananas when they've gone black are not very nice.
We have a few more minutes, and I saw Hedda, you wanted to share some thoughts.
Well, just something that has not been mentioned here, the experience of waiting for fighting troops to come and end the war, just at the end of the war. I was 16. I'm the oldest witness among you here. I was 16 at the end of the war, 45. And we had my mother and my sister, much younger sister, and my mother had decided to move into a safe area where her family lived in the north of the former Czech Republic, now again Czech Republic. You may know it under the name of the Sudetenland Plan.
Yeah.
And we were there because in 44, the war effort by the Germans against the Allies had reached a point where the bombing did not make much difference anymore. So they resorted to psychological warfare, which meant targeted attacks on cultural objects, not war effort factories, but cultural, the Vienna Opera House, the Vienna Cathedral, the Vienna State Theater, all the representative buildings were bombed. And so my mother decided to escape that. And we were then at the end in May when the war was coming to the real end, we were glued to the radio. And we were figuring out the Allies, the Americans were coming from the West, from your area, Pam, Bavaria. The Russians were coming through from the Polish,
Northeast.
and we were figuring out by the distance and the daily reports how far they had gotten, who would reach us in that corner, in that actually corner of the mountains, where we were first, because we were hoping for the Americans. They were enemies, but not brutal, except for the psychological warfare. The Russians, we were hoping that the fighting troops would not reach us first, because they were known for murder. Everything that happens in Gaza happened in Gaza. Rape of, I did not dare show my face at the window, even when the occupation troops had come. Even then, we were not safe.
Good God.
And they were looking for women's faces as easy targets. So at any rate, back up in February, you mentioned Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5. Schlachthof 5 was the address of the main target in Dresden. And Dresden was also a psychological target, because it was a gorgeous Baroque city and cultural center. One day in the evening, we were still in Czechoslovakia, Sudetenland. One day in the evening, we looked at the sky. It was the northern sky, and it was like a huge sunset. And it was the wrong direction for the sunset. It was too early for the sunrise. Later, we heard on the news, it was Dresden burning. Dresden burning, we were hundreds of kilometers south of Dresden. That's what Schlachthof 5 was. Yeah,
Yes, you had that.
that was our experience.
Heavy stuff, yeah.
Well, we've all got a new appreciation for living in Huntington, I think. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you. Thank you.
All I can say is Deb conned me into this when we were at a jazz concert.
Wait, what did you say?
I say you conned me to doing this, but when we were at no, it wasn't jazz, it was a country western.
Yes,
concert.
yeah, no, I started off with music. So thank you. If you guys, like this, we do a lunch and learn the first Friday of every month. I've got a list of things coming up. We've got somebody coming to talk about women on the Pennsylvania frontier, somebody coming to talk about eagles. We're not doing anything in July, and then in August, I've got a professor from Juniata coming to talk about artificial intelligence.
Wow.
So,
Every volunteers, I'll volunteer for about 1,000 steps or something.
There you go.
wait, you talk about what?
About 1,000 steps or something like that. I maintain 1,000 steps.
Like,
Local
okay,
trails.
local trails, that would be awesome.
Yeah.
You know, like, you're like on my list now, right? I have to find out who you are first, but yeah.
I have a whole presentation.
Right,
You do.
There you go. That was easy, Deb.
Thank you. Thank you all. So think of, there's, oh wait, back there on that table is a list of other things in April and grab a list of lunch.
My daughter graduated school and she's working.
You know.
Yeah.